let's begin the process by talking a little bit about the user interface and just kind of getting a feel for where everything is located. So let's open up Mudbox. And before we actually do anything, I'm going to go to Help, and I'm going to click this 1 minute start of movies. And this is going to come up, this kind of welcome box is going to come up when you start Mudbox. And so this is going to give you the opportunity to watch some little movies that are going to go over some of the things that we're going to talk about. And then also you'll see that there's a starting point list in here. So if you want to start from a particular mesh that Mudbox provides, you can click that here to start from a piece of base geometry. You can also access recently worked with files from this right hand side. Okay, so if I go ahead and close, it's just going to give me a blank new scene. And so from this point, let's go ahead and start with kind of taking a look at where everything is located. So the first thing that we'll notice is the views area, and that's going to be just kind of this 3D view. And we'll talk about how to kind of navigate around this 3D view in a little bit. But right now, I just want to focus on the fact that it is here. You can see the 3D view by the grid that we have here, the kind of the grid plane. We also have a view cube up here that lets us move around. Up at the top of the view, you'll see that there are different tabs. So right now we're looking at the 3D view. We can also look at our meshes UVs by going to the UV view, which we don't have anything in, so we can't really see that right now. We can also go into the image browser. That lets us access different 2D images that we have on our hard drive to be able to convert those into stamps or stencils or otherwise work with those. And then we also have the ability to go over to the Mudbox community on the area and access things here. So from here, you could come in, take a look at some other images that people have uploaded. You can also go into the gallery, or you can jump into the library and access stamps and stencils from here and download them directly into your Mudbox installation. So those are the 4 view tabs right here up at the top. Right above those, you'll see the main menu. So it's going to be very familiar. If you go into File, this is where you're going to be able to create new scenes, open scenes, save scenes. You'll see right here that there's one of these items in green. I've left this turned on, and this is basically in 2014, we have the ability to see whatever is new or has been added to Mudbox for this release. So this is kind of cool. You can kind of just truck through here and see all the different pieces or all the different menu items that are colored green, and that lets you know that this is a new feature. You might want to check this out. And we'll definitely be using some of those, and I'm going to go ahead and leave that on so that we can see, oh, yep, that's a new feature. All right, so we've also on the File menu got the ability to send our projects back and forth between other Autodesk applications. So this lets us send our objects back and forth between Maya, between 3ds Max, Softimage. So that's a really nice feature, and the ability to work really closely with other applications is very important here in Mudbox, as we'll see going through our project. Okay, we also have the ability to export and re-import from PSD, and then other importing and exporting, and finally exit. We can go over to Edit, and here we'll see some selection items, undo and redo, duplication, locking and freezing, so just kind of utilities to deal with our geometry. We can also set the symmetrical axis. We can kind of validate our meshes, freeze transformations, and so forth. Under Create, this is where we can actually bring in objects to our scene. So we could create meshes, and these are Mudbox's kind of starting meshes. We could create curves, cameras and lights, create materials, and then we can also create selection sets and stencils and tiling planes. So that's going to be located under Create. And some of these will be able to, you can access those in different ways, but Create, you do have the ability to go ahead and bring those in. Finally, or not finally, but next, down to Mesh, you can see there's a lot of new features in Mesh. So this is where we're going to be able to subdivide our model, so adding new subdivision levels. We can access the options here. In past versions, the options for this subdividing have been located in a kind of a little box over to the right. So if you're looking for that box, it's actually down here. This will allow us to access those options for the command right above it. We can also step up and down. You can see the hotkeys for these are listed off to the right. Okay, we can also rebuild subdivision levels. If we've got something very high res, we want to rebuild lower levels, we can do that. And down here are some new features. So we can reduce the mesh, so take the poly count down a little bit lower. We can also retopologize, so recreate the topology of a mesh. We can create meshes from curves. We can duplicate parts of a mesh into a new mesh. We can flip meshes around, and you can choose the axis here. And we can also do some really cool stuff with face selections. So we can patch holes, we can tighten and fair selections, so smooth it out or flatten it out, which can help you with especially some hard surface type modeling. And then we can transfer details from one model to another. Okay, so if we have one model that has one topology that was sculpted, we have another model that has a different topology, we can transfer that sculpted detail between the two. Now, next one is display. So display will allow us to hide geometry, show geometry. There's a new option for isolating. So if you've got one piece of geometry selected and you isolate that, it kind of basically hides everything else instead of having to hide each thing by itself. We've also got the display options in here, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through that process. But you can see smooth shading, flat lighting, so forth. Those can be checked on and off in here. And we've also got the options for things like turning the grid on and off. So anything that has to do with what's being displayed in our 3D view. Now, one of the things that I want to turn off is this gradient background, just because a lot of times when we're recording videos, that gradient doesn't compress very well. And so I'll go ahead and turn that off. You can see I can also go to expert mode, which takes away the interface. You can see the hotkey for that is T. I can bring that back. So it just takes away the clutter of some of the interface items. Next to display is something that looks a little bit different. This is now UVs and maps. So we've consolidated some of the UV focus stuff in here with the map extraction. So now under UVs and maps, we can create basic UVs here in Mudbox. We can recreate level UVs. We can flatten to UV space, unflatten. So this enables us to kind of squish our model down into what it would look like as a UV. We've also got PTEX set up for creating textures that way. And then coming down to the bottom, this is where we're going to be either extracting all of our maps, so normal maps or displacement maps and so forth. And then also if we want to use those maps as a sculpting base, we can do that in here. So kind of consolidated the UVs and the map creation stuff into this one menu item, which is nice. Right next to that is render. This is where we can kind of output any sort of images that we want to output. So we could either just save screen images, we could record movies, or create a turntable movie if we have our model just kind of rotating around. That's going to be located here under the render menu item. And down to windows, this will allow us to bring up different windows. Some of these are duplicated on the interface. For instance, I can bring up our layers. If you want to have a floating window rather than something over here in the interface, you can bring these up here. Okay, that's under Windows. You can also bring up things like the properties for your brushes and so forth. You can import layouts, export your layouts, things like that. So it allows you to customize things a little bit more. If you want to have something floating off to the side, you can do it there. And then help. This is where you're going to find all the documentation that you need, and you can check for updates and basically anything that you would normally find in help. That's where you're going to find it. All right. So that's the main menu. Let's move over to the right, and this area contains a lot of important stuff in here. So right over to the right, all the way to the right, let's concentrate on these three kind of side tabs here. The first one is the object list, and we can think of this as, if you're familiar with Maya, it would be like the outliner. It's basically just a list of the things in your scene. So right here you can see, here's our top level, here's our scene. You can see we don't have any geometry in it yet. We have 4 cameras, perspective, top, side, and front. We have 1 light, and we have 1 material, and that's all. If we were to start adding geometry, it would show up in here as well. We can turn off or on the visibility of any of these things by clicking the little dot under the eye, and we can also lock any of these by clicking on this column to turn on the little padlock. And then we get some information about any objects in our scene over here to the right of it, and some of these are expandable, so we can come down here on the side and choose image plane or stencil, and we get more information about those. You see as I click on these that we can see the properties of each thing that we've got selected immediately underneath in the properties window. So I can select a material, and you can see the properties in here. I can also double click on a material, bring it up. I'm sorry, right click and choose properties, and you can bring it up that way. If you had a material or an object in here, you could also right click and choose to edit the material from that context menu, which we'll look at a little bit later. All right. And so all of our properties are located right underneath this area. There's also a little kind of arrow up here, and this will allow you to do different things, filtering things that you want to see from that. Now the object list right above that is something called layers. This is where we can access our sculpt layers and our paint layers. And paint layers you can just think of as texture maps, or layered texture maps in sort of a Photoshop kind of way. And your sculpt layers we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's basically sculpting detail on a particular layer that you can turn off and on. And that's going to be located right in here. If we had an object in here, we'd be able to see it right in here and then work with the layer. Okay, there are options in here. You can see that these options have changed now that we're in the layers window. And so there's a lot of different things. We can't do anything right now, but you can merge the layers, delete the layers, and so forth. We go down to viewport filters. This is a really cool thing that we can do here in Mudbox, and that is to kind of turn our 3D view into something that looks a little bit more like what we want to see in our final render. So if we're painting textures, we want to paint them in an environment that looks sort of like what the lighting is going to be for our final result, because the textures will look a lot different depending on the lighting. So this is a sort of on-target presentation stuff that Mudbox is really good at. And so you can turn these filters on, and it just kind of creates a nice view in our 3D view for as we work. And it doesn't really maybe make too much sense yet because we don't have anything in here, but we'll definitely look at that as we go through this process. All right, last but not least, down at the bottom we have a couple of trays. So we've got our tool trays down here. You can see over to the left-hand side we've got the sculpting tools, which we can access any of these tools from this tab. Next, the painting tools. So this is what we would be using to texture. The curve tools, and you can see even down here the new tools here are highlighted in green. So we can draw out curves on our meshes. We can erase curves or create curve loops or border curves. Also, the pose tools allow us to add joints and pose our models. And then the select and move tools. So this is what we can do to select our models, translate, rotate, or scale them, or select faces and work with those, or UV shells. Next to this, over to the right, we have another tray, and this is going to contain our stamps. So these are images that we can use in conjunction with our sculpting and painting tools as kind of the tip of the brush to be able to apply sculpting information or paint in different ways. Next to that is the stencil. This would be something like you'd lay it on a kind of glass overlay, you can think of it that way, and paint through it. So these can be accessed here. Next, the fall off, kind of how our brush falls off. And you can select different fall offs just by clicking on those. Then we've got presets for materials. So we've got some materials already pre-set up to be able to add, as well as lighting presets. And then camera bookmarks. So if you get a view that you like, you can add a bookmark in here and access that later on. So our tools are going to be over kind of to the left, and then we've got presets and stamps and stencils over here to the right. And we can drag on these dotted lines to scale or size any of these interface items up or down as we see fit. Okay, so now that we've got kind of a look around the interface, I should say this bottom status bar or status line at the bottom will give you some information just about what you're working on. So now that we've got the interface taken care of as far as where things are, let's come into the next lesson and concentrate a little bit more on this 3D view. We'll talk about navigating around the 3D view and some of the different places that we can access the tools that we looked at. We can actually access those a little bit more quickly using marking menus and hotbox and things like that. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that in the next lesson.